26 years old, shot multiple times outside a Brooklyn bar, killed over cocaine cut with flour. The NYPD closed the case in 72 hours. What they did not say, Frank James Burke was the last surviving witness to the $5.8 million Lufthansa heist. The same robbery his father planned. The same robbery. Robert De Niro immortalized on screen. His father was in federal prison when it happened. Goodfellas ran 3 hours and never said his name. This is that story. And it is far darker than the film. Francis James Burke was born in approximately 1960 or 1961 in Rockaway, Queens, the first child of Jimmy Burke and his wife Mickey. And from the day he entered the world, he was surrounded by men who killed people for a living. The Vario crew treated the Burke household as an extension of their operations. Paul Vario, the Lucchese capo who served as the real-life model for Paul Cicero, I.N. Goodfellas, was a regular presence, and Henry Hill himself was in and out of the family's life throughout Frank's childhood. Goodfellas showed viewers a romanticized version of that world. The fur coats, the nightclubs, the loyalty. But what it never showed was what happened to the children who grew up inside it. Frank Burke did not choose organized crime, the way his father had chosen it as a survival mechanism in the foster care system. He was handed it as a birthright, trained for it by proximity, and measured against it from the time he was old enough to understand what his father Octua Ellie did for a living. By his early teenage years, Frank was already running errands for the crew that operated out of Robert's Lounge, the bar in South Ozone Park that Jimmy Burke owned and that served as the de facto headquarters for the Lufthansa planning. He was not a peripheral figure drifting toward the life. He was inside it, watching men like Tommy DeSimone conduct business at the next table, while other children his age were watching Saturday morning cartoons. Henry Hill later told investigators that Jimmy Burke brought Frank into the Lufthansa operation in 1978, when Frank was a proxy, motley 17 or 18 years old, assigning him to drive a crash car, a backup vehicle positioned to ram police cruisers if the heist triggered a pursuit. The FBI named Frank as a suspect in that operation, and the Queens District Attorney's Detective Unit confirmed those suspicions in their internal files, though no charges were ever filed because the primary witnesses were either dead, imprisoned, or in witness protection. Tommy DeSimone reportedly told associates that Frank had held up good during his first criminal act, which earned the young man a measure of respect from men who treated violence as a professional credential. That praise, from one of the most documented killers in Lucchese family history, tells the entire story of what Frank Burke's childhood had prepared him for. Goodfellas portrayed Jimmy Conway as a man of charisma and loyalty who ultimately turned on his friends only when forced. The reality was that Jimmy Burke physically abused his own son, used him as a criminal instrument in a 9-figure robbery before the boy was legally an adult, and the FBI's attempt to use that abuse as leverage to flip Frank against his father produced nothing. Because Frank Burke had been conditioned to understand that silence was the only currency that mattered. Frank Burke came of age inside a specific criminal ecosystem that Goodfellas rendered in broad strokes but never fully explained. The borderland between the Lucchese and Gambino crime families in K.N.'s and Brooklyn, where loyalty was negotiated rather than fixed, and where a young man's value was determined entirely by what he was willing to do. His father operated technically as a Lucchese associate. Irish by birth, he could never be formally made, but the reach of Jimmy Burke's crew extended across family lines through business arrangements, shared heists, and mutual debts. When Frank came of age criminally in the late 1970s, he made a choice that reflected both his father's world and his rebellion against it. He aligned himself not with the Luccheses, but with the Gambino crime famille. Why? Building his own associations in Howard Beach, the same Queens neighborhood where John Gotti would later consolidate his own power. The Queens District Attorney's Detective Unit confirmed at the time of Frank's death in 1987 that he was considered a Gambino associate, operating primarily as a dealer, a business his father's bosses had explicitly forbidden, the same prohibition that had ultimately destroyed Henry Hill. The cocaine trade in early 1980s New York was simultaneously the most profitable and most dangerous market any street-level operator could enter, and Frank Burke, NTA, read it without the protection of a formal family membership, without the buffer of a crew around him, and with a last name that was simultaneously a credential and a target. His father was in federal prison by 1982, serving 20 years for conspiracy in the Boston College Point shaving scandal. Without Jimmy Burke on the street, the informal protection his surname had offered dissolved rapidly. Frank built his operation in the gap between his father's incarceration and the Gambino family's tolerance of independent operators, working cocaine distribution through connections in Brooklyn and Queens, while maintaining the pretense of crew loyalty that his father had drilled into him. He lived at 7802 106th Avenue in Howard Beach, not far from the social club where John Gotti held court, and the geographic proximity to Gambino power both protected and ultimately exposed him. The world Frank Burke inherited was already in the process of collapsing around him before he was 30 years old. By 1987, the Lufthansa heist participants were almost entirely dead or imprisoned. Jimmy Burke was serving life. Paul Vario had died in federal prison in May of that year. Henry Hill was deep inside witness protection. And Frank Burke, the last known surviving participant in that operation, was alone, dealing cocaine and cutting his product with flour to increase his margins. That decision, to sell adulterated cocaine to a dealer named Tito Ortiz, was not the act of a sophisticated criminal operating at the level Goodfellas might have suggested for the son of the man who planned the Lufthansa heist. It was the act of a young man who had inherited a criminal identity without the infrastructure, protection, or judgment that his father had spent decades building, and who was running out of options, inside a world that had already consumed everyone around him. Goodfellas gave its viewers the Lufthansa heist as a set piece, the planning, the execution, the $5.8 million in cash, the aftermath of paranoia and murder. What the film did not show was that the heist involved at least a dozen participants across multiple crime families, that its planning took months inside Robert's Lounge at 11 Ford 02, Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park, and that one of those participants was a teenager named Frank Burke, who drove a crash car through the streets around JFK Airport while grown MEFK Airport. Ian in ski masks cleared out the Lufthansa vault. The FBI's post-heist investigation identified at least 12 participants in the robbery, and by the time Goodfellas was released in 1990, 11 of those 12 were dead, imprisoned, or in witness protection. Frank Burke was the 12th, named as a suspect, never charged, dead 3 years before the film premiered. His participation reduced to a classified file that his sister Catherine Burke was still trying to leverage for $100,000 when the production company came calling about using the family name. Frank's cocaine operation in the mid-1980s ran through Brooklyn and Queens with a distribution network that connected Gambino's street-level dealers to suppliers in the Dominican community in Washington Heights. He was not operating at the volume of the major trafficking organizations, but Queens DA detective Lieutenant Remo Franceschini confirmed that Frank was dealing at a scale that brought him into contact with serious operators, men for whom a bad drug deal was not a business dispute, but a death sentence. The flour-cut cocaine that Frank sold to Tito Ortiz was part of a pattern that investigators recognized as the signature of a dealer under financial pressure, someone cutting margins to generate faster cash flow. Frank Burke owed money, and he was using his product to buy time, and the man he sold diluted cocaine to responded the way that world always responded. He found Frank outside a bar on Liberty Avenue and shot high, until he stopped moving. Tito Ortiz, 46 years old at the time of the murder, was arrested and charged with second-degree murder within days of Frank Burke's death. A case that closed quickly and quietly, with no acknowledgement from law enforcement of who Frank Burke actually was or what. Mealy had produced him. The NYPD closed the file on the son of the man who planned the most famous cash robbery in American history, as if they were closing a case on any other mid-level drug dealer who got outmaneuvered by a rival. The real scale of what Frank Burke represented. The last walking line. K to the Lufthansa heist. A witness who had survived every other participant in that operation. A man who had been inside the planning sessions and the execution and had somehow stayed alive for 9 years while everyone around him died. Never appeared in any public filing, any press conference, or any frame of the film that was supposed to tell this story. He was 26 years old, and everything he had seen and done and survived died with him on a Brooklyn sidewalk at 2:00 in the morning. The most consequential institutional failure in Frank Burke's story was not the NYPD's handling of his murder. It was the FBI's decision to pursue Frank as a potential informant against his father, while simultaneously doing nothing to extract him from the criminal environment that was going to get him killed. Federal agents working the Lufthansa case had identified Frank as a participant by the early 1980s, and internal documents from that investigation show they made multiple approaches attempting to use Jimmy Burke's physical abuse of his son as psychological leverage to flip him. Lieutenant Remo Franceschini of the Queens DA's detective squad confirmed publicly at the time of Frank's dia that investigators knew who Frank Burke was and what world he occupied. Franceschini stated directly that Frank was trying to make his bones when he was killed, language that acknowledged the FBI and DA's office had been watching him move deeper into organized crime without intervening to disrupt that trajectory. The FBI's approach to Frank Burke followed the same pattern that destroyed Henry Hill. Allow the target to accumulate criminal exposure. Wait until the pressure becomes unbearable, then offer a deal. But Frank Burke, unlike Henry Hill, never cracked. He had been conditioned by his father from childhood to understand that cooperation with federal authorities was the one sin that could not be forgiven, and every attempt to flip him failed completely. There is no public record of any federal agency offering Frank Burke anything other than the threat of prosecution. There was no offer of relocation, no offer of protection from the Gambino associates he had begun to cross, no acknowledgement that a young man who had been used as a crash car driver at 17 years old might have a legitimate claim to being a victim rather than a perpetrator. He was surveilled, pressured, and ultimately left alone on the street with a last name that announced what he was to every dangerous man in Queens and Brooklyn. Goodfellas never showed you that, because some facts are too large for a television drama to contain. At 2:30 a.m. on May 18, 1987, Frank James Burke's riddled body was found on the sidewalk in front of 1043 Liberty Avenue in Cypress Hills, Brooklyn, a neighborhood that sits along the border of Queens and Brooklyn, exactly the kind of borderland that had defined his father's entire criminal geography. The official explanation was a drug-related killing, a street dispute between a dealer and a dissatisfied customer, simple and brutal and closed within days. What investigators privately understood was more complex. The murder of Frank Burke in May 1987 came within weeks of Paul Vario's death in federal prison. Vario died on May 3, 1987, 15 days before Frank was shot, which meant that in the space of 2 weeks, the last 2 people with direct knowledge of the full Lufthansa participant list were eliminated. Vario died of natural causes at the age of 73. Frank Burke died of gunshot wounds at 26. The timing was noted internally and then set aside. Henry Hill, speaking from witness protection years later, raised the possibility that Jimmy Burke had used Frank not just as a crash car driver during the heist, but as a stick-up man in at least one of the preliminary operations that funded the Lufthansa planning. That claim was never substantiated in court, but it placed Frank Burke at the center of a criminal operation that had already produced at least 8 murders by the time Frank himself died. The systematic elimination of everyone who could testify about what happened inside that vault. The chain of violence that preceded Frank's death had claimed Angelo Sepe in July 1984, Louis Cafora and his wife Joanna in April 1979, Stax Edwards in December 1978, and Parnell Stephen Edwards just weeks after the heist. Each death had been attributed to street disputes, drug deals, or unrelated criminal act. And each death had removed one more witness from the Lufthansa file. Frank Burke was the last name on that list who was still breathing in 1987. Frank Burke's mother, Mickey, identified his body at the Kings County morgue on the morning of May 18, 1987. His father was in a federal prison in upstate New York, serving concurrent sentences that would keep him incarcerated until death, and learned of his son's murder through prison channels. He outlived Frank by 9 years, dying of lung cancer at Buffalo's Roswell Park Cancer Institute on April 13, 1996, alone, imprisoned, having buried his son from behind bars. The criminal world that produced Frank Burke and ultimately consumed him left a specific geography of damage across Queens and Brooklyn that Goodfellas compressed into montage and background. A world where the actual human cost was measured, not in cinematic executions, but in the accumulated wreckage of families who lost sons, brothers, and fathers to a machine that Jimmy Burke had spent 3 decades building and that Frank Burke had tried and failed to survive. The Lufthansa heist alone generated at least 8 connected murders across a 9-year period from 1978 to 1987, ending with Frank Burke's death as the period at the end of that sentence. The cocaine trade that Frank participated in through his Gambino connections was part of a borough-wide epidemic that killed thousands of New Yorkers during the 1980s, a decade when the crack and cocaine markets in Queens and Brooklyn produced homicide rates that made the nightly news look like a war bulletin. Queens County recorded 409 homicides in 1987 alone, the year Frank Burke died, and the vast majority of those killings were connected to the same drug trade that Frank had entered after his father went to prison. The federal government's response to that epidemic, the same government that had surveilled Frank Burke, attempted to flip him and then watched him die, focused its prosecutorial resources on the RICO cases against the 5 families rather than on the street-level distribution networks. The D were actually killing people. The Gambino associates Frank had worked with continued operating for years after his death. Tito Ortiz was convicted of the murder and imprisoned, but the network that had sold Frank the cocaine he was cutting and reselling was never publicly identified or prosecuted. The people who actually paid the price for the world Goodfellas romanticized were not the men in the movie. Not Jimmy Conway or Tommy DeVito or Henry Hill, all of whom survived long enough to see themselves portrayed on screen by Hollywood stars. The people who paid were the residents of Cypress Hills and Howard Beach and South Ozone Park, the families who found their children dead in cars and on sidewalks, the women who identified bodies at the Kings County morgue, and the one woman who stood in that morgue on the morning of May 18, 1987, and identified what remained of the boy she had named Francis James. Goodfellas ended with Henry Hill complaining about living like a schnook in witness protection, eating frozen food instead of pasta, mowing his own lawn. The real ending of that story was a 26-year-old body on a Brooklyn sidewalk and a mother who had to bury her son while he husband was in federal prison, and the film that told that story gave that woman's child not a single line of dialogue, not a single scene, not even a name. Frank Burke's death was not the result of a sophisticated law enforcement operation or a rival family's strategic decision. It was the result of a single bad business decision made by a young man who was financially desperate and operationally isolated. He cut his cocaine with flour, sold it to a dealer named Tito Ortiz, and Ortiz killed him for it. The most consequential criminal legacy of the Lufthansa heist ended not with a dramatic takedown or a courtroom testimony, but with a fraudulent drug transaction in Brooklyn. The vanity that destroyed Frank Burke was not his father's vanity. Jimmy Burke's weakness had been his compulsion to eliminate witnesses, a pattern so obvious that Henry Hill recognized it as the moment he understood. His own name was on the list. Frank's weakness was the assumption that the Burke name still carried weight in a criminal landscape where his father was serving life in federal prison, and every man who had once protected that name was dead or imprisoned. He was dealing cocaine in a neighborhood C, controlled by Gambino associates, while operating without a formal crew, without protection, without the kind of organizational backing that might have discouraged a man like Tito Ortiz from responding to a bad deal with gunfire. The sequence from that weakness to his death was compressed into a single night. The adulterated deal, the confrontation, the shots outside the bar on Liberty Avenue, the body on the sidewalk. Goodfellas suggested that the world Jimmy Burke built collapsed because Henry Hill cooperated with the FBI. That betrayal was the mechanism of destruction. The real mechanism of that world's destruction was simpler and more brutal. Jimmy Burke raised a son inside a criminal machine without giving him the tools to survive it, and that son died on a Brooklyn sidewalk at 26 because the only world he had ever known had stopped protecting him the moment his father went prison. Frank James Burke destroyed himself the moment he chose to cut his cocaine with flour and sell it to a man who had no reason to absorb that loss quietly. Not because he was reckless, but because he had run out of alternatives inside a world that his father had built, and that his father, left him to navigate alone. On the morning of May 18, 1987, the sun came up over Cypress Hills, Brooklyn, and illuminated a stretch of Liberty Avenue where the NYPD had already begun their preliminary investigation of a homicide that would be closed within weeks. The body of Francis James Burke, removed. The crime scene photographed and documented, the neighborhood continuing its ordinary morning without pause. The empire that Jimmy Burke had spent 30 years constructing. The network of favors, debts, violence, and silence that had made him the most feared non-made man in the Lucchese Millie had by that morning been reduced to a federal prison cell in upstate New York at a chalk outline in Brooklyn. Paul Vario was 15 days dead in a federal medical facility. Henry Hill was somewhere in witness protection. Tommy DeSimone had been dead since January 1979. What Jimmy Burke had built was a machine for generating criminal revenue through hijacking, loan sharking, narcotics distribution, and murder. And he had built it with a crew that included at its outermost edge his own teenage son, whom he stationed in a crash car outside the most audacious robbery in New York history. Called it preparation. He had bribed law enforcement officers, corrupted airport workers at JFK, ordered the deaths of men who owed him money, and survived every federal investigation that came within reach. And then he went to prison and left his son on the street with nothing but a name. The irony of Jimmy Burke's final years was that the man who had never been formally convicted of a single Lufthansa-related murder died of lung cancer in a Buffalo hospital in April 1996, while the one living participant in that heist who might have told the story from the inside had been rotting in Cypress Hills for 9 years. The federal government never got the testimony it wanted. The sealed files remained sealed. The Lufthansa heist, as a legal matter, was never fully solved. Jimmy Burke died in a room in Roswell Park Cancer Institute, with no windows that faced anything except the Institutiona. L corridor, outside his door. A man who had controlled neighborhoods and corrupted officials and ordered murders, spending his final hours in a space smaller than the walk-in cooler at Robert's lounge. His son had been dead for 9 years. His empire had been dead for longer. The real reason that war, LD, collapsed was not Henry Hill's testimony, not the FBI's surveillance, not the RICO statutes that dismantled the 5 families across the 1980s. It collapsed because the men who built it treated their own children as instruments, raised them inside the machine, handed them criminal identities, BEF. Or they were old enough to refuse and then left them exposed when the machine broke down. Frank Burke was not destroyed by law enforcement. He was destroyed by inheritance. Power in the world. Jimmy Burke occupied required invisibility, the ability to operate beneath the threshold of institutional attention, to be dangerous without being visible, to be known inside the life without being documented outside it. Jimmy Burke spent 30 years cultivating that invisibility and then handed his name to a son who wore it on the street in Brooklyn while dealing adulterated cocaine to men who would kill him for a bad transaction. The name that had protected Jimmy Burke became the thing that made Frank Burke a target. The moment Frank Burke chose to cut his cocaine, to take that shortcut, to gamble that Tito Ortiz would absorb the loss and move on, was the moment he chose to be seen. He chose the immediate need over the invisible survival his father had spent a lifetime practicing, and he made that choice in a neighborhood where being seen by the wrong person cost exactly what it cost him. The body of Francis James Burke was 26 years old when it was found on Liberty Avenue, and it carried inside it the last living memory of everything that happened inside the Lufthansa vault at JFK Airport on December 11, 1978. A memory that nobody in law enforcement, journalism, or Hollywood ever successfully extracted. The Lufthansa heist remains, in its complete human detail, unsolved. Every man who knew the full story is gone, and the one who might have talked died alone on a Brooklyn sidewalk before anyone thought to ask him the right questions in the right way, leaving behind nothing but a closed NYPD file and a name that Robert De Niro never had to say.